Welcome. Hello. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad everyone's visiting here in the room, and if you're at home, I hope you're visiting with someone too. It's only not if they're imaginary. That might not be good. For those who are not in Dallas today, it is hot and sticky, more sticky than hot, and yes.
Our windshield wipers worked totally back and forth from like oil to past Walnut Hill.
Because it was sprinkling?
Yes.
Yeah. We woke up to rain this morning.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. But tonight's supposed to be the main event, I think. Maybe.
Let's hope not.
Yeah, I don't know. Glad to have the Earleys with us from Santa Fe in the flesh. Oh, you're here for Vacational Bible School? Yeah. Oh, wonderful.
Second grade.
Okay, awesome. That's fabulous. Well, last week we finished up the Minor Prophets, and I know some of you are thanking Zeus for this. I wanted to take a little interlude today and talk a little bit about two big events that are coming up and give some historical context and answer your questions. So the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting is happening here in Dallas beginning tomorrow. Well, actually, parts of it begin today. But I want to talk about, and then there's a gap of a week, and the week after that is the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship General Assembly that we're affiliated with that's going to be in St. Louis this year. But there's so much in the news about all of this, and I thought it might be helpful to give some background, not only on current events, but how we got here historically as well. I remember being raised, a good Southern Baptist kid in Oklahoma, and I had an aunt and uncle who lived in California who their family got swept up in the non-denominational movement. This was in the 60s and 70s when, if you were a Southern Baptist, non-denominational was a cuss word, right? And as was the word parachurch. It was a dirty word because these were people who were not aligned with the church, right? And we felt about them the way Catholics probably felt about us after the Reformation, right? So they weren't part of the real church, right? They were off working against the actual church. Now, that's easy for a Southern Baptist to say in the 1960s and 70s because we were the powerhouse of everything, and particularly in the South. Well, now they're in California, and that's a whole new, brave, Wild West world out there. I've told y'all before that my mother had two uncles who were from Oklahoma who in the 40s, maybe even the 30s, 40s, left Oklahoma, went to Southern California to be Southern Baptist pastors, to be pioneer missionaries in this place that was godless, right? Well, there were Christians already there. There were even Baptists already there. They were just American Baptists, not Southern Baptists. But what happened with the westward migration of that era was that you had a whole bunch of people from Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas, who went westward for the jobs and all that were happening in California, and they wanted to take their churches with them because they got there and they didn't have a Southern Baptist church. So this is how California became this weird hodgepodge of religious expression that has always been a bit on the vanguard, both for progressivism and for conservatism. And it is hey, welcome, glad to see you. It is a mistake to think that to think that California Baptist churches are all liberal. They are not at all. Some of the most conservative Baptist churches I know are in California because it's a real mixed thing. This is my friend Derek.
Hey, Derek.
This is what?
This is my friend from Oklahoma.
Oh.
Yes.
His information.
Yeah. He's the director of missions. Yeah. We're going to talk about associations in just a minute. So I finished the minor prophets last week, and we're taking an interlude to talk about denominations and the SBC and what's going on this week and how we got here. So I may ask you some questions. Okay. Yeah. So that's just one example here in the United States. But most of us have grown up, I think all of us have grown up somewhere in the South primarily, where we have been the dominant culture and we know the history recently. But it's not always been that way. And this is part of what's going on in the shifting sands of American religion today. And if you're asking where's the Bible in this, there's going to be some Bible in this, I promise, along the way. So back to California. I have this first cousin who's attending an early Calvary Chapel in Bakersfield, California. Okay, so Calvary Chapel is one of the first big, well-known, non-denominational churches that happens up and down the coast in California. And we're like in junior high. And, junior theologian Mark, we're having this conversation where she says, well, denominations are just a fabrication. And, that it doesn't really matter. And again, this is a junior high conversation, right? And I'm staunchly, attached to our Southern Baptist Church. And if you're a true Christian, you're Southern Baptist, right? And what apostasy are they off in? And that was before my uncle took me one Sunday when I was visiting there to Melody Land, which is a charismatic Pentecostal church in Los Angeles, where I had my socks rocked off and didn't know what in the world had happened to me. So they're off in all this whole thing, right? So that from a young age made me think about, okay, what are we doing here with denominations? Why is the church fractured? So one of the most common examples we get from Scripture of this is the prayer of Jesus in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, my prayer is that they may be one. Well, we are anything but one. We are many, 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 many. And this has happened over time. I need to remind you that for the majority of the Christian church's existence, there was one church. And it's what today we call the Roman Catholic Church. Now, some of our Baptist forebears would disagree with me, and we talked about this before, because they want to make the case that Baptists in some form have always been there, subterranean, and I think that's a tough case to make. But anyhow.
Church of Christ also.
Well, Church of Christ, yeah, but that is absolutely not true of the Church of Christ. I mean, I can say that definitively, right?
Well, I must tell you, I was driving back to California with my brother, and this was in Cloudcroft.
Oh, yeah.
There's a Church of Christ there, established AD 33.
I know, right? There you have it.
It's in stone.
Yeah, it must be true. If it's in stone, it must be true.
It's on the computer, it's on the internet.
Yeah, so remember that the early church was not a denomination of any kind. It was a movement. It was, when we read in the book of Acts about the formation of the early church, these are house churches. There are no buildings. There are no sanctuaries. They are replicating, in a way, the work of the temple, but they do not have a temple. And so they're gathering in small things. And over time, over several hundred years, the early church movement grows into something that begins to replicate the temple experience without the sacrifices. And so you begin to, you can see the archaeology and excavations of some of these ancient places of worship, and they're not giant cathedrals. I mean, the cathedral happens much, much later in progression. But over time, the church sort of coalesces. Now, what most of us in the West don't understand is that before the Protestant Reformation, there was a bigger split between East and West in the church. And we would call this today the difference between Catholicism and the Orthodox. And among the Orthodox today, there are at least 15 distinct groups that largely are ethnic or regional, that they use a different word. The Baptist word is autonomous. They use a different word that I can't, it's a big word. I can't remember. Autocephalous or something like that. Gives but there's a first among equals among them, and that is the Bishop of Constantinople. All right? So this is so far off our radar for most of us that we forget these people exist, and yet there are Orthodox among us here in Dallas as well. One of my employees is an Orthodox Christian. He was raised Church of Christ and found his way out of the church and then found his way back into the church, to the Orthodox church that sort of rescued him. And so and he stands in the choir and chants, every Sunday with them. So I think you're aware of the other big split that happened along the time of the Protestant Reformation due to Henry VIII not being able to get his marriage annulled, right? And this is where we get the Anglican Church splitting off from the Roman Catholic Church. And the main expression of the Anglican Church among us today is the Episcopal Church in the United States, which is very influential, but very small. As I said last week or week before, the Southern Baptist Convention has lost more members than the Episcopal Church has. So this is, the scale here is like vastly different. But the Episcopal Church is well established and very, very wealthy, which helps keep things going. That's another story. So I'm just tracing quickly how we get here. And as we talked about previously, Susan?
When you said this employee of yours was an Orthodox Christian, are you talking about like what we think of as Greek Orthodox?
Yes, he's Greek Orthodox.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So there's Greek Orthodox, there's Russian Orthodox, there's Ukrainian Orthodox, there's 15 of them. Yes, Carol Ann?
Okay, explain to me what an Orthodox is. I mean, we're saying the Roman Catholic and then
Yeah.
Orthodox.
Okay. So Orthodox, the Orthodox are very Catholic, but they disagree on some things. And the most important thing they disagree on is a one line. This is the way splits happen, y'all. One line in the Nicene Creed that's called the Filioque. And the Filioque is a fancy way of talking about from whom the Spirit derives. So the Orthodox Nicene Creed says that the Holy Spirit derives from the Father. The Catholic Nicene Creed, and the one we would use, says that the Spirit derives from the Father and the Son. And so it's a matter of hierarchy. Now, also, quickly, the Orthodox observe the major religious holidays on a different lunar cycle than what the Catholic Church does.
Don't they have their own sort of pope or leader? I mean,
So the Bishop of Constantinople would be sort of the first among equals. Yeah.
Who's that?
His name is Bartholomew.
I mean, it's like their pope or what?
Well, not exactly, because, again, he's a first among equals, whereas the Pope is not equal with anyone, right? So there's two different visions of this.
Kind of like a Peter?
Yeah, they would say that. Yeah. Now, remember that the Catholic Church also maintains that the Pope is in a direct line of succession from St. Peter, which is about as much hooey as the Trail of Blood for Baptists. So, sorry, that's my famous, technical word, hooey, for that. So what's happened is it was not until really the time of so you have the Protestant Reformation, and then you have the Enlightenment after this that sort of spawns these other denominational movements. So most of the expressions of Christianity that we know in the multifaceted form that we live in today are really creations of the 17th and 18th centuries. They are not that old. Now, when the white folks came to America from Europe, it's well established that you had the Spaniards come and they brought Catholicism, and that's like our region. But on the East Coast, those who came were largely Puritans, and there were some folks we would call Anglicans, But there also were some Baptists in that group, early Baptists. Now, to be honest, the Baptist movement really, as we talked about last week or week before, sometime I mentioned this, we're not technically Protestant because we were not birthed out of the Reformation. We're sort of ancillary to that. But for practical purposes, we're Protestant, right? So it's nickel and dime in it. So our movement came out of this Anabaptist movement that also birthed other groups that you know. The Brethren, the Mennonite, the Quakers. All of these groups share a heritage with us in this movement called the Anabaptist movement that was all about baptism. And this is why in our Baptist culture, baptism is a really, really big deal. Yes?
Henry Stone wants to know if it's historically accurate to say that Anabaptists were protesting against the Protestants.
Sort of. So Henry wants to know, were the Anabaptists protesting against the Protestants? And the answer is yes and no. So what they were protesting against was the state church, in part. So the early Baptists were accused of being child abusers because they would not baptize their infant children. Because a tenet of the Baptist movement is believers' baptism. That you are baptized by your own confession of faith, not by your parents baptizing you, right? So this is why this is so important to us historically, because literally our forebears were burned at the stake, drowned, jailed, beaten for this, because they were accused of abusing their children for not. Now, you can understand that, because think about all the chatter today about folks who have transgender kids, and some folks accuse them of abusing them, right? So it's easy to raise child abuse, but this was a religious thing again then that sort of propelled this, but it was also a matter of conscience. And so I won't go into the whole, some of the story, Roger Williams and First Baptist Church of America in Providence, Rhode Island, and all that. But I want to fast forward to get you to where we are today. Because, yes.
Were these groups, the Mennonites and all the various groups, did they come from Europe, or did they later change to that in the United States?
No, they came from Europe.
Okay.
Yeah, all of this originated in Europe. Even the Baptist movement originated in Europe. Even though there are more Baptists in America today than there are in Europe. Well, not in Europe as a whole, in England.
So I've got a question about
Yeah.
whatever caused people to baptize babies, because Jesus did not do that.
Oh, now that is a
And
great
John
question.
the Baptist didn't do that.
Yeah, okay. So that could be a whole nother lesson or three in that. The question is, whatever caused people to baptize babies? And it's a very practical answer. And it has to do with the fact that much more in the past than now, infants died all the time. It was really not uncommon for newborns to not make it and for children to die because of diseases. It was just a very different world. And there's always this issue, well, are they going to heaven? Like, are they protected? And so one of the ways the church comes up with the answer to that is we're going to baptize them, right, and make them Christian in advance. That will cover this, right? So the church, concocts a theology, right, to answer a question that needs to be answered. Now, while I'm criticizing the Catholic Church, I'll criticize us because we too have concocted a theology that I believe, but, it's not really in the Bible. We call it the age of accountability. And our teaching is that, a child is not accountable for their sins until they reach the point where they can consciously be aware of that and make a decision.
Old law had that.
So what did?
The old law had the accountability age in which they would go through whatever the Jewish.
Oh, the Jewish law, right? So there's some evidence for that, right?
We don't believe, though, that we have to be saved, you have to be baptized.
No, we do not.
People think we do.
But Catholicism does. right? And so these are all these differences.
So, okay, so, you know, the other view is that Crystal said in his sermon, not saying he's right, no, but he had said, I think it was Constantine when he became a Christian.
Yes.
He was over as all of his people in, you know, that part of the world.
Right.
He said, I want all of my people to be Christian.
Yes.
Therefore, they need to be baptized.
It was a force.
So he set on all these big old irrigation type troughs, and all the people had to go under them and be baptized. Because there wasn't time and river enough for water to baptize everybody. So everyone had to go under, and everyone was forcefully baptized.
That part's true. How it happened, I'm not sure, but yes.
So that was supposedly, that's the way he said, that was the beginning of the sprinkle.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I've never heard that story, but have you ever heard that? Yeah, interesting. Carol Ann?
Okay, would we consciously baptize someone that we did not believe knew the Lord?
No.
Okay,
Say that
good.
again.
Would we consciously here baptize someone we believe had not made a personal decision? And the answer is no, which is why we do not baptize 6-year-olds. I mean, it's just a common thing. Typically, and I don't know Timothy's opinion on this. I suspect it's similar to what George's was, but you'll have a 5 or 6-year-old come, and it's sweet, it's precious, right? But we want to make sure. I mean, here's where we're more conservative than people would think, right? We want to make sure that this child is of an age where they really understand the decision they're making. Yes.
Catholics have confirmation.
So what happens is we do the learning up to make a decision and be baptized thing, and Catholics flip it. They do baptism first and then lead to confirmation, and you reaffirm your faith, right? So we do similar things, we just do them backward to each other. We have the order backward, right?
Well, that's what the Methodists and the Presbyterians.
And so the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Lutherans follow the Catholic model, even though they're Protestant, right? So this is where Baptists are different. So let me quickly fast forward because I've got somewhere else I want to get on this. So pilgrims, others come to America, white folks come to America. There are no Baptist bodies. What the very first form of grouping of Baptists that happened after the formation of the colonies was something we would call the association. And Derek here is the director of missions for an association in Ardmore, Oklahoma. The association still exists as a unit within Baptist life today, but in the early days, it was the only thing that existed. There were no conventions or larger denominations. Churches came together to cooperate in a local region to do something, right? And it was not until 1814 that the first sort of regional, I dare say national, which is a stretch given what I'll explain in a moment, we'll call it a national body, was formed, and it was called the Triennial Convention of General Baptists. And the Triennial Convention was formed to bring together Baptist churches and associations for the purpose of doing missions work. And it was based in Philadelphia at the time. Now, again, this predates most of the westward expansion, so we're dealing with, the eastern and southern United States here. And things rocked along for about 25 years until there was a southerner who came forward who wanted to be a missionary, who was a slaveholder. And there was a dispute within the body about whether a slaveholder could be appointed a missionary. And you can see there was a difference between North and South. 1845, this split creates the Southern Baptist Convention. So the southern part of the country splits off from the Triennial Convention and forms their own group, which becomes the second big Baptist body, right? The Triennial Convention, so basically this happens north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, roughly. And in this, ultimately, Southern Baptists, take off and grow over the next century tremendously. The Northern Baptists become eventually, it's several decades later, they changed their name to the American Baptist Churches USA. And that group still exists today. And we're friendly with them, but we weren't always, right? There was disagreement for a long time. Another misnomer people have today is this SBC is conservative and the ABC is liberal. The ABC is all over the place. I know some very conservative American Baptists, and I know some very liberal American Baptists. There's just contention within them. They are much more ethnically diverse than either CBF or the SBC. A lot more black representation because of their heritage and where they come from and all that. So 1845, SBC is formed. What's happened since then is there's been increasing attention in the 20th century on the denomination as a national body. And the association that begins as the founding unit of cooperation among Baptists ends up being pushed into second place behind the national body, actually third place, because you end up with state bodies. So here in Texas, we have the Baptist General Convention of Texas, for example. So you have a national convention, and then you have a state convention. You have these all over. And then within that, you have associations, right? And part of what happened 100 years ago this spring was the creation of a unified giving plan called the Cooperative Program that sort of institutionalized a way of funding all three of these entities that prioritized the hierarchy. So you gave through your church, which then gave to the state convention and gave to the association, and then gave the state sent money onto the national convention. So there's this very complicated system of funding that happens that sort of keeps everyone in their place. And this is all very dependent. Now, why did this all happen? This is the Bible part. All right. It happened not because someone said, oh, we need to have a party and get together. It happened because Baptists at root are missionary people and said, we need to find a way to work together for the cause of missions. And again, what started off as a slaveholder seeking to be a missionary was still a missionary impulse, right? And this has really pulsed through all of our Baptist life over time. Baptists have associated with each other largely for missionary purposes, except when there was a different purpose. And that is doctrinal. And the big thing we're seeing happen among Baptists today is there are two, even in the SBC, you'll see this week, there are two groups of people who have two different motivations for wanting to be together. One group is this, that I grew up in, is this desire for missions and cooperation. We can do more together than we can do alone. Another group is looking for doctrinal purity. We want to be in fellowship with people who believe exactly like us. And the parameters are narrow. Now, that actually goes back historically more to an association than a larger convention, because in the early days of associations, doctrinal conformity was much more important. But again, think about the 20th century and all of this is about a fight against modernity as well, right? Those who are pushing for doctrinal conformity in the SBC are largely wanting to roll back the clock about 100 years because they really like that time a lot better because it was more strict in these doctrinal beliefs, right? And so what you're going to see play out this week is a tug of war, really, between these two factions. And so the whole issue over passing a constitutional amendment about prohibiting women from being pastors or having any authority in the church is a doctrinal issue. It is not a missional issue. And this is why it was so ironic 2 years ago when Saddleback Church got kicked out of the SBC, because Saddleback and Rick Warren are among the most missional Southern Baptists I've ever known in my life. I mean, their whole motivation is church planting and evangelism and all, and they've grown into the largest Baptist church in America, right? But they were not doctrinally pure, so the doctrinal purists wanted them out because they don't care about that. Whereas, the SBC I grew up in, nickels and noses mattered. You wouldn't kick out your largest church because it's going to make your numbers look bad, right? But still, there's that. I left out one important thing, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to have some questions. Some of you might be saying, okay, but what about all the Black Baptist denominations in America today? Where did they come from? Well, remember that, now I'm speaking about Baptists, but there's a similar trajectory here that happened among Methodists in particular, right? And most of the other denominations do not have a larger history within the Black community as much as, the majority of Black Protestants in America, even today, are Baptists, except those who are becoming non-denominational, right? And we've talked about the non-denoms before. So what happens is you have churches all across the American South where you have slave-held people who are in the balcony of the churches. They're worshiping in the same churches as their owners and masters, but they're relegated to the balcony. And they are out of sight and out of mind. And then along the time of the end of slavery, these folks go and start their own churches. And you may remember one of the most famous examples of this that we've dealt with was our former pastoral resident, Scott Dickinson, who's now in Mississippi, but for many years was at First Baptist Church of Christ in Macon, Georgia. And this is a classic case of this, where there was the First Baptist Church of Christ, and when he got there, across the parking lot, there is another First Baptist Church that is the Black Baptist Church. And it was a split off of the white church way, 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 way back, right? And one of the things Scott did through the New Baptist Covenant work was help rebuild. Here were two Baptist churches existing across a parking lot from each other that had nothing to do with each other because of history. And Scott and the pastor at the other First Baptist Church became friends and sort of knit that relationship back together. They're still separate churches, but they have a much better relationship today. But once upon a time, they had been one church, right? So what I'm trying to convey through all this is the prayer of Jesus that we may be one is really aspirational today, right? It is hard to find unity around much of anything anymore, which is why the rise of the non-denominational church is so significant. I've talked about that in here before. Some of the largest churches in Dallas today are non-denominational. They have no, they may call themselves Bible churches. They may just call themselves some church, right? But they have no denominational affiliation, which also means they have no accountability to anyone. They can do whatever they want. And there's some problems in that as well. All right, I've talked and talked and talked. Questions, comments? Yes?
Child evangelism, there are groups that really go after the young.
Yes, it's a whole movement.
Yeah, and I think one of the Bible churches I went to did that.
Okay, there used to be an organization based in Fort Worth that was literally called Child Evangelism Network or something like that.
Yeah.
Is it still there? Yeah, over by the seminary.
And they, well, the seminary, a lot of Bible churches use people from Dallas Theological Seminary.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. What happens to me a lot in Dallas, I'll be meeting someone for the first time out in the community, and they'll find out I went to seminary just in the course of conversation. Oh, did you go to Dallas Theological Seminary? It's the default assumption around here.
Bible College. No.
Right. Okay. Yes.
How do you, like you mentioned before how Park City Baptist is dropping away from the Southern Baptist Convention. Yet I assume they're going to probably keep their Baptist name.
Yeah, and they're still affiliated with the Baptist General Convention of Texas.
Okay, they are. Are there any movements, any lawsuits or anything about saying when you switch or you drop from a group, you can no longer carry this name?
No, because the word Baptist is not trademarked.
Okay.
right?
Anything Methodist did?
No.
Any Methodist did?
Well, I mean, yeah, think about all the schism that's happened in the United Methodist Church within the past couple of years. And you have, so in the North Texas Conference here, and I don't know, the North Texas Conference doesn't run into Oklahoma, does it? Yeah, that's a separate thing. I don't know. So our experience here is among the Methodists, about half the churches in that conference left.
In Oklahoma, what you're seeing is a lot of the small town Methodist Church, First United, are staying First United. They only have 30 or 40 people at the most. It's kind of your large steeple churches that are moving out.
Okay.
So if you go through, like within my association, like Hilton and Ringling and the smaller towns, they're all remaining United Methodist. They've got that local connection in Oklahoma City.
Okay. Yeah. So what's happened here is you've had a cleaving with people leaving, and not just leaving one direction. Some of the larger United Methodist churches have left to almost become independent, right? They have not joined. There's a new group called Global Methodists that's sort of the breakaway denomination. But some of these larger churches haven't even joined that group. Some have created yet a third thing, and some are doing nothing.
What's
So,
the split based on? What's the disagreement?
homosexuality,
Yeah, okay.
largely. And biblical authority, they would say as well. Yeah, it mirrors what's happened in the SBC.
Theirs is so much more complicated because there's an issue of who owns the property.
That's right.
Whereas when you asked about Baptist, I mean, technically the SBC outside of convention movement is not going to come in regarding property or names or anything of that.
That's right.
They're not concerned.
Autonomy.
Yeah.
The key word in Baptist life is autonomy. Grady.
When I meet someone, they find out I'm Baptist, I have a real desire to clarify that a whole lot.
Well, you have to around here.
It's crazy Baptist, I'm a more inclusive Baptist.
Right? Yeah, that's why we came to that line, we're not that kind of Baptist, some years ago, right? But, like, you will likely get conversations this week from friends and neighbors who read something about the Southern Baptist Convention and assume you know what's going on. So I want you to have some knowledge about this, right? So that you're aware. So the Southern Baptist Convention remains by far, I mean, without any equivocation, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, even though it's declining in numbers.
14 years in a row.
Right. Yeah, 2 decades worth. Yeah. But this is the story of denominations in America writ large. It's not just the SBC. It's that the SBC couldn't stave off what was happening to everyone else, right? Every denominational body, pretty much, except some of the small, very conservative ones that are new, they're sort of growing, but that's a whole other story. Every established denomination is declining today. So there's nothing different there. But there's still this huge, huge influence, right? Now, the reality is, I had this number in my head last week or week before. I think nationwide it's something like 6% of people are Southern Baptist. It's a single-digit percentage, right? But there's tremendous influence, right? And so what you're going to see play out this week is several things. One of them is ongoing conversation about doctrinal parameters as it relates to women. The other big thing that's going to play out is there's a fight brewing, and all Baptists love to fight, y'all. So, you know, it's just sort of in our DNA. You can't blame that just on Southern Baptists. So one of the big things is a debate about how the Southern Baptist Convention is represented in Washington, D.C. and other places on ethical and political issues. And there are those who love to support the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and there are those who love to vilify the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And it is the smallest of the SBC entities with a teeny tiny budget based in Nashville. And just as a reminder, this is the predecessor organization that Carol's father, Foy Valentine, led it was called the Christian Life Commission at the time, right? So this is the successor organization to that. So, and you probably best know a guy named Russell Moore, who was head of this organization until he sort of got run out. And he's landed okay. He's editor of Christianity Today, and he's making it all right, I think, but traumatic time. And the guy who succeeded him is under fire, in part, because he has 3 kids who attend Covenant School in Nashville, which is where that shooting was. What, 2 years? Was that 2 years ago? 3 years ago? And he's been very active in a parent group there. And some of his critics think he has forced a gun rights issue into the ERLC that no one's voted for them to have. And it's just a weird confluence of things. And the latest thing that's sort of silly but true at the same time is, well, no one in D.C. in power knows who the Southern Baptist folks are, and and again, we've talked about this before, the parachurch movement has outdone them, right, on that. So these are 2 of the things, and God knows what else may happen, because what always makes news is resolutions. And resolutions are allegedly non-binding. But the SBC loves to adopt these position statements on things that only expresses the will of the people gathered there at that time, but they tend to make news. And so we'll see. There's one on gender and family and all that's pretty out there in my view, but it's just a jumbled mess. But anyhow, that's one of the things. Now, for the 2nd week in a row, I've posted a story on a Sunday morning, which is highly, highly unusual. There is a really interesting wrinkle that's tragic in all of this morning. So all of this chatter about sexual abuse in the SBC that has been being dealt with for the past 5-6 years in particular, one of the key players in this is a woman named Jen Lyell, Lyell, who used to be an executive with Lifeway Christian Resources, the publishing arm. And she is the woman who accused a seminary professor in Louisville of a long-time grooming and abusive relationship that ultimately has been very divisive among folks. People, some believe her, some don't believe her, right? And there was a settlement with the SBC Executive Committee, a public apology, and last night she died prematurely. She had a massive stroke and died. And the lawsuit involving her is ongoing. And I cannot quite calculate what this ripple is going to have at this moment in this, because Jen is someone that her critics have loved to just, she's been the whipping girl for everything that's wrong with talking about sexual abuse in the SBC. And are you going to speak ill of the dead? and nothing nefarious about her death, by the way. She just had a stroke. Nothing. There's no indication of anything foul on this. It's a tragic story, right? And that brings us back to say we're dealing with real people here, right? And it's so easy when we get to talking about church stuff to get deep in the institution and protect the institution that we forget about the people. And the reason associations and state conventions and national conventions were formed was to help people. But every time you get an institution, and here's where my cousin in 1970 whatever was right in a way, in that denominations can corrupt the church, right? Just like Catholicism can be a corruption of the church. It's not just the Vatican we have to worry about, right? It's all of us whenever the institution becomes more important than the mission. And this is something that I think we all ought to struggle with. It gives me tremendous pause because most of us are just geared, in this institutional mindset. And this is why there was a lot of beauty to the Bible church movement, the parachurch movement, because in its origins, it sought to be this, But guess what's happened over time? The parachurch movement has gotten institutionalized. And now there's a lot of effort to protect the institution, right? The institution that really isn't an institution, but yet it is, right? So here's an example of this that I'll give you. One of the great fruits of the non-denominational movement, again in California, was the creation of a seminary called Fuller Theological Seminary. We've had pastoral residents through here who are graduates of Fuller. DJ Reed, if you remember DJ, went to Fuller. And Corey Alvaro, who's married to John Jay, is currently a student at Fuller. And it's a fabulous school. But they have prided themselves on being interdenominational, multi-denominational. And in that, they've had to try to maintain support from the more conservative element. And so they've been through like a 2 or 3 year study on, are they going to affirm same-sex marriage or not? And just 2 weeks ago, their board of trustees came down to say, we're not going to change anything. We're not going to make any positive affirming statement, but we're also not going to belittle people who believe differently than us. That's a very watered down version of what they said. And so they tried to say this was a third way, but in reality, it was just maintaining the status quo on this. And this is protecting the institution that is a product of the non-denominational church. And so if you're tempted to get on your high horse about the SBC this week, just point back at everyone else, because all of us are in this same boat. So in 2 weeks, the CBF annual General Assembly will be held. And, you know, many of you have been through this with us. CBF is so small compared to the SBC. I mean, we're about 1,800 churches at best. And the SBC is 14,000 churches? No, 40.
Well, 30, probably around 37,000.
37,000 churches. So, I mean, you know, this is like mom and pop shop versus Walmart, right? I mean, it's just vastly different scale. And we're organized in a different way where we don't really do business. We don't pass resolutions. We don't, you know, we get together and focus on the things we want to talk about. So there's not typically much news out of that in the same way. So, you know, what's happened over time, and I think if you listen to the podcast that Ben Cole and I have done, we've documented this pretty well. Over the past 20, 30 years, the SBC has moved more to the right and CBF has moved more to the left. And the gap between the two is even bigger theologically, politically, culturally, right? Which also is driven just by things happening in culture. So you won't hear nearly as much about CBF as you will about SBC. There'll be a lot of reporters here covering the SBC. Why? Because it's the nation's largest Protestant denomination. And it has a lot of influence still. Jim?
So what should we, knowing time is
Yes.
coming to an end, what should we expect to see discussed or reviewed? I know that a majority of the people in the SBC are going to be those small churches that are all very conservative. So it's going to be a tough fight, but what's to be expected out of it?
Well, Liz, so I'll give my prognostication, and we'll see if Derek agrees or disagrees with me on this. He's closer to the ground than I am on it. I think you will see the so-called law amendment, which is the effort to enshrine in the SBC Constitution a prohibition against women in any type of pastoral role. So it passed in 2023 on first reading. It failed to get the 2/3 majority last year. It got a majority, but not a supermajority to be ratified.
Pastoral, okay, but they could be a minister?
No, cannot be at all.
Okay.
No woman can have the title minister or pastor. Right.
Okay.
Right. So, or preach. Right. So that failed barely last year to be ratified. It is coming back this year it's resurrected, right? Up from the grave. And I think it will pass. Do you think it'll pass? Yeah. I think it'll pass. What's going to happen to the ERLC is the other big question.
What's that?
The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Okay.
There's going to be an effort to defund it or to kill it.
What is that?
It is, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is the SBC's voice for ethical and political issues. It's very pro-life, but it's also tied up in religious liberty stuff and all that.
It's our lobbying.
It's a lobbying arm.
They're lobbying to Washington.
Somewhat, and everywhere else, yeah. And it's an interesting mix because they're trying to educate churches while also lobbying.
It's a very jumbled, part of the issue is they don't have a very clear job description. So it says religious liberty, but they basically repent Republican
So
propaganda.
it's just a lobbyist, it's not a government entity.
No, it's an SBC entity.
Oh,
Yeah, it's an SBC. It's basically their public policy arm, right? And so there will, if a motion arises to defund it from this next year's budget, it will be dead, and that's all it takes is one vote. If there's a motion to abolish the entity, that's going to take 2 consecutive years' vote, right? So pay attention to that. The other big thing is there is an unprecedented recommendation. The SBC's budget is called the Cooperative Program, and to take, $3 million off the top of that in the next budget to help pay legal fees for all the sexual abuse cases. Okay, so off the top, right? So the argument is, okay, that's $3 million that's not going to missions and evangelism, right? And I can see by your reaction, and you're not even Southern Baptist, right?
Can I qualify that? Because I think a lot of that money is being spent against some Southern Baptists pushing back and filing lawsuit against the SBC.
Oh, yeah, no, it's, yeah.
Without a doubt. So
Oh, yeah. It's internal stuff too.
this isn't just families suing the SBC.
This is Johnny Hunt.
This is churches and pastors suing because of defamation.
Right. So it's very complicated. The Pandora's box has gotten open on this. So the question is, if that part of the budget is not approved, what happens? Because that money does not exist anywhere else right now. And so this is very contentious. I mean, it's not usual to have a contentious budget.
Is it voting for allocating it, basically kind of having an admission, yes?
Well, some would say yes. But the reality is the cases are there whether you like it or not. They exist. There's 28 current cases pending against the SBC related to sexual abuse of all different kinds, right? Grady.
And you're saying the $3 million is to defend it?
To help pay legal fees for the SBC.
Just legal fees. Just the legal.
Legal and settlement fees.
Not, okay, settlement
Yeah.
also, okay.
Right. Yeah. And they've already spent, what, 11 million?
Over 10.
Yeah.
Where's that coming from?
Well, it came out of reserves.
so they would be defending the ministers. or-
Well, no, they're defending themselves because people are filing lawsuit against the SBC to say, you should have prevented this. Or, as Derek said, you defamed me by mentioning me in your report, right? So it's one of those things where the more you get into it, the stickier it gets, and it's almost impossible to get out. And this is what some people warned about from the beginning, why they didn't want to talk about it, right? Why they didn't want to talk about it. So,
What are reserves, you said? 11.
yeah, so the SBC Executive Committee, that's the coordinating entity, had some financial reserves, like set aside, rainy day money.
Until Nashville, I don't know when Nashville's convention, until about 5 years ago, you never heard about the executive committee.
Right. They're like, in the background.
They were just quiet operating.
They're the central nervous system of the SBC, right? They run things behind the scenes. But the thing that you need to understand is, I talked about the Episcopal Church having a lot of money. The Southern Baptist Convention has a whole lot of money. It's just spread out. No one person or entity has control over all of it. So if you took all the endowments and the properties that exist in all the entities, it is $1 billion or more. I mean, it is vast. But a lot of that's in real estate, seminary campuses, other buildings, and so forth. And that's not, I mean, all the churches, unlike the Methodist Church, which technically owns those, the SBC doesn't own those buildings, right? So that's a whole other thing. And the big argument in all this has been something called ascending liability. So where does it stop? If abuse happens in a local church, is the SBC responsible because that was an SBC church? Could they have done anything to stop it?
Has that been decided ever in a court on any case?
Well, not really, because most courts have refused to get involved in it because they determine it to be a religious matter. But there's other cases that are pressing that. What really complicated it was there was a call for the SBC to create a database of known sexual abusers. Because what's happening is they're getting passed from church to church to church. Yeah.
Can I provide
Yeah.
an easy example? So within my association, I have 32 churches. I'm the director of missions. I resource those churches, but I have zero binding authority over any of those churches. So let's say First Baptist Church, so-and-so, Oklahoma, that's in my association, had a minister that the church came to me and said, we know this minister has done X, Y, Z. I would have zero binding authority. I can't even go to the church unless I'm invited. So when we talk about denominational hierarchy within the SBC, that's one of the questions that keeps coming back is no one from Nashville can come in and say, okay, this guy, we know this guy has done this or this person has done this. And that's where people who come from different churches look at it and go, well, the bishop should be able to come in and just
Right.
it's done.
But it can't happen in Baptist polity. Yeah, that's a great example of that.
We've got to.
Okay, so these are some things to be looking out for this week. But again, think back. The scripture for today is John. My prayer, Jesus says, is that they may be one. And so the question is, how can we be one even though we are many? I think denominations are not a bad thing because they allow us to gather in smaller groups, somewhat smaller, to be a representation of the church. Just as we go to different schools and we work in different places and we live in different communities, but we're all working for the good of humanity. That's a positive side of denominations if we don't focus on the institution instead of the person. So let's pray together. God, grant us grace today, and we pray especially for our brothers and sisters who will be gathering in Dallas this week for the Southern Baptist Convention, and pray that you would grant them grace and wisdom and strength for all that they must do for the cause of your kingdom. We pray through Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, Charlene's going to come with our prayer time.